9,000 years ago, hunters built stone corridors on a ridge between two land masses that no longer exist. They drove caribou through lanes of carefully placed rocks toward waiting men with spears. Today, that entire hunting complex sits 37 meters beneath the surface of Lake Huron, and the only way to reach it is with sonar, diving equipment, and a willingness to accept that the ground beneath the Great Lakes holds secrets most people never think to look for. That ridge is just the beginning. Across 5 lakes spanning more than 240,000 square kilometers of surface water, researchers have found sunken warships from the American Revolution still standing upright in total darkness, over 1,000 ancient copper mines on a single island, World War II fighter planes in rows on a lake bottom like a drowned parking lot, a steam locomotive that vanished for over a century, human burials with skulls deliberately modified in ways no one fully understands, disappearing indigenous carvings on an island in Lake Erie, and an entire 18th century fortified town buried beneath the ground at the junction of two lakes. These are not legends. Every one of them has been excavated, surveyed, photographed, or recovered, and every one of them still carries questions that have not been answered. Let's start with the oldest. Somewhere around 9,000 years ago, the water levels across the Great Lakes Basin were radically different from what we see today. Enormous volumes of water were still locked in retreating glaciers, and the lakes themselves had not yet filled to their modern shorelines. In what is now the middle of Lake Huron, a long, narrow limestone ridge stretched above the waterline, connecting the landmass we call Michigan to what is now Ontario. Geologists call it the Alpena Amberley Ridge. It was dry land. Caribou migrated across it, and people hunted them there. For decades, nobody imagined that evidence of those hunters might survive beneath the lake. Then, beginning in the early 2000s, a research team led by John O'Shea at the University of Michigan started using sonar to map the lake bottom along the submerged ridge. What they found changed the way archaeologists think about the Great Lakes. Roughly 56 kilometers off the modern Michigan shoreline, at a depth of about 37 meters, the sonar images revealed something that did not look natural. Long, linear arrangements of stone, parallel lanes, V-shaped formations. Structures that looked like low walls or barriers, positioned in ways that matched known caribou drive lane systems documented in Arctic and subarctic contexts. When divers and remotely operated vehicles examined the features up close, the picture became clearer. These were not random rock scatters. The stones had been placed deliberately, forming corridors that would funnel animals in predictable directions. Some formations created what archaeologists call hunting blinds, low enclosures where a hunter could crouch, hidden from the approaching herd, until the animals passed close enough for a kill. The principle behind caribou drive lanes is well documented from ethnographic and archaeological sources across northern North America. Migrating caribou follow predictable routes, especially at water crossings and narrow land corridors. If you understand the terrain and the animal's habits, you can construct low stone barriers, brush lines, or Inuksut-like cairns to channel the herd toward a specific point. The animals do not need to be physically blocked. They simply prefer not to cross unfamiliar obstacles, so even a low line of rocks, barely knee-high, is enough to redirect their movement. Hunters waiting in blinds along the lane can then intercept them. What made the Alpena Amberley Ridge discovery extraordinary was not simply that stone tools or isolated artifacts turned up on a lake bottom. That happens occasionally. What stunned researchers was the scale and preservation of an entire hunting landscape. The structures were not scattered randomly. They formed an organized system, with lanes, blinds, and staging areas positioned in relation to one another and to the topography of the ridge. For archaeologists, this was like finding a complete factory floor instead of a single discarded wrench. Radiocarbon dating of organic materials and geological analysis of the ridge's submersion history placed the use of these structures at roughly 9,000 years before present, during a period when the ridge was exposed and the regional ecosystem supported large caribou herds. As water levels rose with glacial melt, the ridge gradually submerged and the hunting complex disappeared beneath the lake. And here's the part that makes the discovery so unusual in the archaeological record. On dry land, a 9,000-year-old site would have been plowed, built over, eroded, looted, or bulldozed many times over. The Great Lakes effectively sealed it. The cold freshwater, the depth, and the darkness created a kind of accidental preservation vault. No farmers disturbed the stones, no roads were built across the lanes. The hunting complex simply sat on the lake floor, untouched, for millennia. The site has allowed researchers to study not just individual artifacts, but the spatial relationships between structures, which reveal how groups of hunters organized themselves, how they anticipated animal behavior, and how they coordinated seasonal activities across a landscape. That kind of information almost never survives in the archaeological record for sites this old, and it only survived here because the lake swallowed the evidence before anything else could destroy it. If you think that the Great Lakes only preserve things made of stone or wood, the next discovery proves otherwise, and it involves a material that shaped trade networks across half a continent. About 650 kilometers to the northwest, surrounded entirely by the cold waters of Lake Superior, sits Isle Royale. It is the largest island in the largest freshwater lake in the world by surface area. Today, it is a national park, remote and sparsely visited. But thousands of years ago, people traveled significant distances to reach it, and they came for one thing: copper. Isle Royale and the surrounding Keweenaw Peninsula region of Upper Michigan contain something geologically remarkable. Instead of copper locked inside sulfide ores that require smelting at high temperatures to extract, the bedrock here holds deposits of native copper, pure metallic copper. Pieces of it sit exposed in rock crevices, embedded in basalt flows, or lying in glacial till. Some pieces are small nuggets, others weigh hundreds of kilograms. Indigenous peoples recognized this resource and exploited it on a scale that still surprises researchers. On Isle Royale alone, archaeologists have documented more than 1,000 ancient mining pits and workings. These are not subtle traces. Many are clearly visible depressions in the ground, sometimes several meters across, surrounded by broken rock, discarded hammerstone fragments, and debris from the extraction process. The mining technique was effective and, given the available technology, remarkably sophisticated. Miners built fires on the surface of the rock to heat it, then threw cold water onto the heated stone, causing it to fracture and crack along natural weaknesses. Once the rock surrounding a copper deposit was broken, they used heavy stone hammers, some weighing 5 kilograms or more, to pound the copper free. Because native copper is malleable, it could then be worked cold, hammered into shape, annealed by heating and cooling, and formed into tools, weapons, ornaments, and ceremonial objects without any need for smelting furnaces or knowledge of casting. The earliest reliably dated copper working activity in the Lake Superior region extends back at least approximately 4,500 years, and some researchers argue for even earlier dates, though the exact chronology remains debated. What is not debated is that this represents one of the oldest major traditions of metal use anywhere in the Americas. But the real puzzle extends far beyond Isle Royale. Copper artifacts whose chemical signatures match Lake Superior sources have been found at archaeological sites hundreds and even thousands of kilometers away, across the eastern woodlands, into the Ohio Valley, down into the southeast, and beyond. This means that either the copper itself traveled through extensive trade and exchange networks, or people carrying copper moved across enormous distances, or both. The scale of these exchange networks has forced archaeologists to rethink assumptions about indigenous societies in the Great Lakes region. These were not isolated bands of hunters living in small, disconnected groups. The copper evidence reveals organized extraction, processing, and long-distance distribution of a valuable material, sustained over centuries. It implies social networks, agreements about access to mining sites, seasonal labor organization, and reliable methods of transporting heavy material over water and land. No mysterious lost civilization is needed to explain this. What the evidence shows is that indigenous communities accomplished something genuinely impressive using stone hammers, fire, water, and an intimate knowledge of geology that modern observers sometimes underestimate. The uncomfortable part is not that we cannot explain how they did it. We can. The uncomfortable part is how long it took the archaeological profession to fully appreciate what they accomplished. If you find that kind of overlooked history compelling, here is a question worth thinking about. How many other sites like Isle Royale might exist across the Great Lakes, still undocumented, still misunderstood, still waiting for someone to look more carefully? Leave your answer in the comments because that question is far less settled than most people realize. Now, from the mines of Isle Royal, we move to something much harder to interpret. Not copper, not tools, not structures. Human remains. And a set of modifications to the human skull that archaeologists can describe in detail, but cannot fully explain. On Bois Blanc Island, near the Straits of Mackinac, where Lake Michigan meets Lake Huron, archaeologists excavated a site known as the Juntunin site. It was a major seasonal settlement, occupied roughly between AD 800 and 1400, a place where indigenous communities gathered to exploit the rich fisheries of the straits during productive seasons. The site was excavated in the 1960s by a team from the University of Michigan, and the results were extensively published. Among the most significant findings were 65 human burials. Some were individual internments. Others were collective deposits, ossuary-style burials in which the bones of multiple individuals were gathered together and placed in a single pit. This type of collective secondary burial is well documented among indigenous groups in the Great Lakes and Northeast, and is associated with ceremonial practices involving the reburial of defleshed or partially decomposed remains, sometimes after an extended period of above-ground exposure or temporary burial. But within this burial assemblage, approximately 10 individuals displayed something unusual. Portions of their cranial bone had been deliberately removed, not broken accidentally, not damaged by post-depositional processes like soil pressure, root action, or animal disturbance. The edges of the removed sections showed characteristics consistent with intentional cutting, scraping, or working of the bone during or shortly after death. How do archaeologists distinguish intentional modification from accidental damage? Several criteria come into play. Intentional cuts tend to produce smooth, regular edges, sometimes with visible tool marks. Accidental post-mortem breakage usually produces jagged, irregular fracture patterns. Root etching leaves distinctive branching marks. Soil compression causes predictable deformation. Rodent gnawing leaves parallel grooves of specific widths. When none of these taphonomic processes adequately explain the pattern, and when the modification appears on multiple individuals in the same assemblage, researchers consider the possibility that the modification was deliberate. At Juntunin, the pattern was consistent enough across several individuals that the excavators and subsequent analysts concluded that intentional cranial modification had occurred. But what did it mean? This is where certainty runs out. The honest answer is that no one knows for sure. Several interpretations have been proposed. Some researchers have suggested the modification could be connected to trepanation, a practice documented in many cultures worldwide, in which portions of the skull are removed for medical or ritual purposes. Others have suggested it may relate to post-mortem processing of remains as part of mortuary rituals, perhaps connected to the preparation of bones for secondary burial in ossuaries. Still others have raised the possibility that cranial bone was removed for use as an artifact or amulet, a practice documented in some ethnographic contexts. None of these explanations has been definitively proven for the Juntunin remains. The specific cultural context, the beliefs, the ceremonies, and the social meaning behind the practice belong to communities whose oral traditions were disrupted by centuries of colonization, disease, and forced displacement. What the archaeologist holds in hand is the physical evidence. The meaning behind it has been largely lost. This is not a failure of science. It is a recognition that material evidence can show us what people did without always revealing why they did it. The Juntunin burials remain important because they document a consistent mortuary practice at a major seasonal gathering site during a period when Great Lakes communities were developing increasingly complex social and ceremonial traditions. The site itself is one of the key reference points for understanding the late woodland and early contact era archaeology of the Upper Great Lakes. The burials, the fisheries, the seasonal cycles, and the evidence of long-distance exchange all point to a society that was far more organized and ritually sophisticated than a casual observer might expect. The mystery is real, but it is a human mystery, not a supernatural one. Something was done to these people's skulls, deliberately and repeatedly, and we do not know exactly what it meant. That gap in understanding is, in its own way, more unsettling than any invented explanation could be. From a mystery of bone, we move to one carved in stone, and this one has been slowly erasing itself for nearly 200 years. On Kelly's Island in Lake Erie, there is a slab of exposed limestone that once carried one of the most elaborate collections of indigenous petroglyphs in the Great Lakes region. It is called Inscription Rock, and what happened to it is almost as interesting as what was carved on it. The carvings were formally brought to public attention during the 19th century, with descriptions dating back to at least 1833. Early observers recorded a complex panel of images carved into the flat limestone surface. The depictions included human and animal figures, what appeared to be scenes of activity or narrative sequences, and abstract symbols whose meanings were not immediately clear to European-American observers. The petroglyphs are generally associated with the late prehistoric to early contact period, roughly AD 1200 to 1600, and are typically attributed to indigenous peoples of the region, though identifying the specific cultural group responsible for every carving is difficult. Some researchers have connected aspects of the imagery to broader traditions found among Algonquian or Iroquoian-speaking peoples, but the attribution remains tentative. What makes the story of Inscription Rock particularly poignant is the speed at which the carvings deteriorated. The limestone is soft. Lake Erie weather is harsh. Waves, wind, rain, frost, and human activity all attacked the carved surface. By the time serious documentation efforts began, portions of the rock were already worn, chipped, or obscured. 19th century military officers and researchers, recognizing that the carvings were disappearing, made detailed drawings and descriptions of what they could still see. One of the most important early records was produced by Captain Seth Eastman, a U.S. Army officer and artist who created illustrations of the carved surface. These drawings, along with written descriptions by other observers, became the primary record of carvings that would later fade beyond recognition. Today, much of the original detail is gone. Visitors to the site can see the rock and some surviving carved lines, but the fine detail, the specific figures, the narrative sequences, all of those depend heavily on the 19th century records. The rock is still there. The carvings are ghosts of themselves. Several interpretations have been proposed for the imagery. Some researchers have suggested the panels depict historical events, perhaps encounters between groups, ceremonial activities, or significant journeys. Others have interpreted certain figures as spiritual or cosmological symbols. A few have suggested connections to broader petroglyph traditions found across the eastern woodlands. But without a surviving oral tradition that specifically explains this particular rock panel, all interpretations remain provisional. What is not provisional is the site's significance. Inscription Rock is listed on the U.S. National Register of Historic Places. It is recognized as one of the most important petroglyph sites in the Great Lakes region, and the lesson it offers is not only archaeological, but cautionary. Without the foresight of those 19th century observers who drew what they saw before it vanished, we would know almost nothing about what was once carved there. The rock would be just a weathered limestone slab on an island in Lake Erie, and one of the most elaborate indigenous rock art panels in the region would be completely invisible. Sometimes the greatest threat to a mystery is not that someone solves it. It is that the evidence quietly disappears. Now, from a surface that is slowly losing its story, we descend to a depth where a story has been preserved with almost eerie perfection. And this one involves a warship, a storm, and more than 2 centuries of total darkness. On October 31st, 1780, during the American Revolutionary War, the British sloop of war HMS Ontario set out across Lake Ontario. She was a relatively new vessel, purpose-built for service on the Great Lakes. Aboard were Royal Navy crew, British soldiers, and approximately 30 American prisoners of war. Estimates place the total number of people on board at more than 120. She never arrived. A violent autumn storm struck the lake, and the Ontario disappeared. There were no survivors. No wreckage was found on shore. No bodies were recovered. The ship simply vanished, and for more than 2 centuries, no one knew where she lay. The search for HMS Ontario became one of the longest-running quests in Great Lakes shipwreck hunting. For roughly 35 years, a pair of dedicated shipwreck explorers, Jim Kennard and Dan Scoville, searched the lake using progressively more sophisticated sonar equipment. They scanned enormous areas of the lake bottom, year after year, gradually eliminating possibilities. Then, in 2008, they found her. The wreck was resting upright on the lake floor at extraordinary depth. When the first sonar images resolved, the shape that emerged was unmistakable. It was a ship, and not just the scattered remains of a ship. The Ontario was intact to a degree that stunned even experienced wreck hunters. Portions of the masts were still standing. The stern windows were visible. Gun ports lined the hull. The overall structure of the vessel, from bow to stern, was preserved in a condition that would be unthinkable in a saltwater environment. Why? The answer lies in the specific conditions of deep fresh water. In the ocean, shipworms, a type of wood-boring mollusk, can consume a wooden hull in a matter of years. Saltwater corrosion attacks metal fittings. Strong currents scatter debris, and warm surface waters accelerate biological decomposition. Deep freshwater flips nearly every one of those factors. The Great Lakes lack the salt that marine borers need to survive. The temperatures at depth hover just a few degrees above freezing year-round. Light does not penetrate to the bottom, which suppresses algal growth and photosynthetic organisms. Oxygen levels are low, and the depth itself protects a wreck from surface storms, wave action, ice scour, and human interference. The result is that a wooden ship resting at the bottom of a deep Great Lake can survive in a state of preservation that borders on the uncanny. The Ontario is the most dramatic example. She has been described as the oldest confirmed shipwreck discovered in the Great Lakes, and her condition places her among the best preserved 18th century warships found anywhere. The exact coordinates of the wreck have not been made public. The explorers who found her, along with heritage authorities, made a deliberate decision to keep the location confidential. The Ontario is treated as a protected site and a military grave. More than 120 people died aboard her, and their remains are presumably still with the ship. Publicizing the location would invite unauthorized diving, artifact removal, and damage to a site that has survived intact for nearly 250 years, precisely because no one could find it. If this kind of forgotten history grabs your attention, consider subscribing, because there is much more hiding beneath these lakes than most history books ever mention. And the next discovery is one of the strangest military stories in American history. During World War II, the United States Navy had a problem. It needed to train enormous numbers of pilots to land on aircraft carriers, one of the most dangerous and demanding skills in military aviation. But every available carrier in the Pacific and Atlantic was desperately needed for combat operations. You could not pull a carrier out of a war zone to use it as a floating classroom. The Navy's solution was remarkable. They converted two Great Lakes passenger paddle wheel steamers, the USS Wolverine and USS Sable, into freshwater training aircraft carriers. The ships were modified with flat flight decks, arresting gear, and the basic equipment needed to simulate carrier operations. Then they were deployed on Lake Michigan. Think about that for a moment. In the middle of the American continent, on a freshwater lake surrounded by the cities of Chicago and Milwaukee, the United States Navy was operating aircraft carriers. Pilots who would eventually fly missions over the Pacific first learned to land on a ship pitching in the waves of Lake Michigan. Between 1942 and 1945, thousands of pilots completed their carrier qualification training on the Wolverine and Sable. The program was essential to the war effort, but carrier landings are inherently dangerous, even under ideal conditions. The flight deck of a carrier is short. The approach speed is precise. The margin for error is almost non-existent. And during training, pilots were, by definition, not yet proficient. The result was predictable. Approximately 128 aircraft went into the lake during training accidents. Planes overshot the deck, missed the arresting wires, stalled on approach, or suffered mechanical failures and crashed into the water. 8 pilots were killed. The rest were rescued, debriefed, and sent back up to try again. The aircraft sank to the bottom of Lake Michigan and stayed there. For decades, they sat in the cold, dark, fresh water, accumulating silt but suffering remarkably little deterioration. The same conditions that preserved HMS Ontario, cold temperatures, low oxygen, absence of saltwater organisms, worked their preservative effect on aluminum, steel, rubber, fabric, and even some painted surfaces. According to the U.S. Navy, the collection of aircraft on the bottom of Lake Michigan represents the largest and best preserved group of submerged historic Navy aircraft in the world. That is not a casual superlative. It means that more World War II-era naval aircraft survive intact at the bottom of this single lake than in any other underwater location on Earth. Beginning in the 1990s, salvage teams began recovering some of the aircraft. Several have been pulled from the lake, restored, and placed in museums. Among the most significant recoveries was the only surviving example of the Vought SB-2U Vindicator, a dive bomber that saw action in the early part of the war, including at the Battle of Midway. Every other Vindicator in existence had been scrapped, destroyed in combat, or lost. The sole survivor spent decades on the bottom of Lake Michigan before being pulled from the silt and painstakingly restored. For underwater archaeologists and aviation historians, the Lake Michigan aircraft represent something more than a collection of wrecked planes. They are a frozen catalog of American naval aviation technology during a specific critical period. The aircraft types, their modifications, their equipment, their condition at the time they went in, all of this constitutes a record that paper documents alone cannot provide. You can read a manual for a Hellcat or a Corsair, but examining an actual aircraft that has been preserved in cold fresh water for 80 years tells you things that no manual ever captured. The lake bottom, in effect, became an unintentional archive. The Navy never planned it that way. It was an accident of geography, wartime necessity, and the preservative chemistry of deep fresh water. But the result is one of the most unusual military heritage sites anywhere in the world. From aircraft at the bottom of a lake, we move to something even more unexpected. An entire steam locomotive that plunged off the edge of the Canadian Shield and vanished for more than a century. In 1910, Canadian Pacific Railway locomotive number 694 was hauling cars along the rugged northern shore of Lake Superior, somewhere along the stretch of track that clings to the rocky Canadian coastline east of the modern town of White River, Ontario. The terrain there is severe. The tracks run between sheer rock faces on one side and steep drops to the lake on the other. Rockfalls are a constant hazard. On that day, rocks had fallen onto the tracks. The locomotive struck the debris, derailed, and with its attached cars, left the rails and plunged down the steep embankment into Lake Superior. 3 railway workers were killed. The accident was documented in railway records, but the locomotive itself disappeared. Lake Superior at that point drops off sharply. The bottom near the shore can reach significant depth within a short horizontal distance. The locomotive, weighing many tons, rolled and slid down the underwater slope and came to rest among enormous boulders and broken rock in deep water. Recovery in 1910 was out of the question. The technology to locate and salvage a heavy object at that depth simply did not exist, and the railway company wrote off the loss. Over the following decades, the exact location faded from active memory. People knew a locomotive had gone into the lake somewhere along that stretch of coast, but no one knew precisely where it lay. For 106 years, locomotive number 694 sat on the bottom of Lake Superior. Then, in 2016, a team using a remotely operated vehicle located the locomotive approximately 235 feet, around 72 meters, beneath the surface. The ROV footage showed the locomotive lying among massive rocks on the underwater slope, its boiler, wheels, and frame clearly identifiable despite more than a century of submersion. The discovery was remarkable not for its archaeological complexity, but for its sheer improbability. This was not a ship designed to be on the water. This was not an aircraft that crashed during a water-based mission. This was a land vehicle, a steam locomotive, that effectively fell off the edge of the continent and disappeared into one of the deepest, coldest, most opaque bodies of fresh water on Earth. And it stayed hidden there, completely undisturbed, for 106 years. The wreck lies off the Canadian shore of Lake Superior. It is not a U.S. archaeological site, and its discovery underlines something that researchers working on the Great Lakes have come to understand deeply. These lakes do not give things back easily. The combination of depth, cold, darkness, size, and remote shoreline means that objects that enter the water can remain undiscovered for decades, for centuries, and in the case of the Alpina Amberley hunting structures, for thousands of years. The locomotive is still down there. The lake has not finished keeping its secrets. Now, for the final discovery, we leave the water entirely and go beneath the ground. But the location is still within sight of the lakes. Near the Straits of Mackinac, where Lake Michigan narrows to meet Lake Huron, stands one of the most intensively studied archaeological sites in the Great Lakes region. It is the remains of Fort Michilimackinac, an 18th century French and later British fortified settlement that served as a hub for the fur trade, military operations, and intercultural contact for the better part of a century. The French established a presence at the straits in the late 17th century, and by the early 18th century, a fortified settlement had taken shape. It included a stockade, houses, a church, stores, barracks, and associated structures. The community was not purely military. French-Canadian traders, their indigenous wives and families, Métis individuals, Jesuit missionaries, soldiers, laborers, enslaved persons, and travelers from many nations passed through or resided at Michilimackinac. It was a crossroads. After the British took control of the region during the 7 Years' War, they maintained and expanded the settlement. But in the late 1770s and early 1780s, the British decided to relocate their military position to the more defensible Mackinac Island, a short distance away. The move was essentially completed by 1781. The old fort was dismantled, its useful materials were hauled away, and the site was gradually abandoned. Within a few decades, the remains had disappeared beneath the ground. Then, in 1959, archaeologists began systematic excavations. What they uncovered over the following decades was extraordinary in its scope and detail. Working season after season, researchers exposed the foundations of houses, the outlines of cellars, post molds marking the locations of stockade walls, sections of the fortification perimeter, and the remains of a remarkably well-preserved powder magazine. They recovered weapon components, gun flints, musket balls, brass hardware, iron tools, keys, buckles, buttons, and the everyday debris of a working settlement. But what genuinely surprised researchers was not the military material, it was the diversity of the rest. Among the thousands of artifacts recovered from Michilimackinac were European tin-glazed ceramics, fragments of Chinese export porcelain, glass trade beads in dozens of varieties, silver trade ornaments, brass and copper alloy jewelry, thimbles, needles, straight pins, combs, gaming pieces, smoking pipes of European and indigenous manufacture, wine bottles, pharmaceutical bottles, religious medals, crucifixes, and food remains including fish bones, animal bones, seeds, and nutshells. The Chinese porcelain is worth pausing on. Here, at a frontier outpost in the upper Great Lakes, hundreds of kilometers from the nearest colonial city, archaeologists found fragments of porcelain manufactured in China, shipped across the Pacific or around the Cape of Good Hope, moved through European or colonial trade networks, and carried inland by canoe, portage, and overland trail to a stockaded settlement on the Straits. Its presence at Michilimackinac is direct physical proof that this apparently remote settlement was connected, through layers of trade, transport, and commerce, to a truly global economy. The trade beads tell a similar story. Glass beads manufactured in Venice, Amsterdam, and other European centers were a standard medium of exchange in the fur trade. At Michilimackinac, they appear in enormous quantities and varieties, reflecting not only the scale of trade, but the specific preferences of indigenous trading partners, who had strong opinions about bead color, size, and style. The site also revealed evidence of how different cultural groups lived in close proximity. French-Canadian house lots contained different artifact assemblages from British military quarters. Indigenous-associated deposits showed yet another material pattern. The archaeology allowed researchers to reconstruct, building by building, household by household, how a complex, multicultural community organized itself within the walls of a small, stockaded settlement. This is what makes Michilimackinac remarkable. It was not simply a fort. It was a node in a network that connected indigenous trapping grounds in the continental interior to French merchants in Montreal, British imperial administrators in Quebec and London, Venetian glassmakers, Chinese porcelain workshops, and Atlantic shipping routes. The people who lived there, French, British, Indigenous, and Métis, were participants in a global economy, and the objects they left behind prove it. The excavation has continued for decades and is now one of the longest-running archaeological projects in North America. Mackinac State Historic Parks maintains the site, and a reconstruction has been built over portions of the original foundations, allowing visitors to walk through the settlement and see where the evidence was recovered. The surprise is not that an old fort existed at the Straits of Mackinac. That was known from historical documents. The surprise is what the archaeology revealed about the complexity, the global connections, and the multicultural reality of life at a place that history books once dismissed as a remote frontier outpost. The ground told a different story, and the artifacts forced researchers to rethink what frontier actually meant in the 18th century Great Lakes. So here is what the Great Lakes contain, just from the 8 discoveries we have examined today. A 9,000-year-old hunting landscape sealed beneath Lake Huron. Over 1,000 copper mines on a single island in Lake Superior, feeding exchange networks that reached across the continent. 65 burials on an island in the Straits of Mackinac, some with skull modifications whose purpose has been lost. Indigenous petroglyphs on Kelly's Island that were already disappearing before the first camera was invented. A Revolutionary War warship standing upright in total darkness at the bottom of Lake Ontario, treated as a military grave. More than 100 World War II aircraft on the floor of Lake Michigan, including the only surviving example of an entire aircraft type. A steam locomotive that fell off a cliff on the Canadian shore and hid for 106 years beneath Lake Superior, and an entire 18th century settlement buried at the junction of 2 lakes, its artifacts connecting a remote stockade to workshops in Venice and kilns in China. These are not myths. Every one of these discoveries was made by people with sonar, shovels, diving equipment, remotely operated vehicles, and the patience to look where nobody else thought to look. And the unsettling part is not what has already been found. It is the overwhelming mathematical certainty that more is still down there. The Great Lakes cover a combined area larger than the entire United Kingdom. Their deepest points exceed 400 meters. Their shorelines, if straightened, would stretch for more than 16,000 kilometers. Entire sections of their lake floors have never been surveyed. Thousands of kilometers of submerged former coastline, where people once lived, hunted, fished, and buried their dead, have never been examined. What we have found so far is not the whole story. It is whatever happened to fall within reach of the handful of researchers who thought to look. The rest of it is still there, in the cold, in the dark, on the bottom. If this video changed the way you think about what lies beneath freshwater lakes, share it with someone who still assumes that the deep water holds nothing interesting. And if you know of another Great Lakes discovery that deserves to be in this list, put it in the comments, because the lakes are not done surprising us, and neither are the people willing to search them.